setting the stage, the last days of World War II. May 1945, Europe was teetering on the edge of collapse. Cities lay in ruins, their streets scarred by relentless Allied bombings, and countless civilians wandered in a haze of fear, exhaustion, and despair. Germany, once the powerhouse of continental Europe, was crumbling from every direction. The Reich's leaders were either dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th had left the Nazi hierarchy in disarray, creating a vacuum of power filled with panic, confusion, and desperation. In these final days, the Allied forces were advancing inexorably from both the east and west. From the west, American and French troops had crossed into German territory, moving toward Austria with disciplined determination. From the east, Soviet forces advanced through Eastern Europe, leaving a trail of devastation and liberation in their wake. Amid this chaos, countless German soldiers faced a choice: fight to the last man for a lost cause, surrender to the Allies, or seek survival in the shadow of their collapsing command. High in the Austrian Alps, the snow-covered landscape seemed frozen in time, but beneath the pristine white veneer, tension and fear simmered. Castle Itter, an imposing fortress perched on a steep hilltop, overlooked a frozen valley and a scattering of small villages below. The castle had once been a symbol of power and prestige, with its ancient stone walls, towering turrets, and commanding views of the surrounding Alps. In the winter of 1945, however, it had been repurposed into a prison for high-profile French captives. Among them were former generals, politicians, and members of the French resistance men who had dedicated their lives to fighting fascism, and who now found themselves confined behind iron bars, their fates entirely in the hands of the collapsing Nazi regime. For these prisoners, the war had been long and harrowing. They had endured years of harsh treatment, forced labor, and the constant threat of execution. Yet, as May approached, there was a fragile sense of hope. Rumors of German surrenders, advancing Allied troops, and the imminent collapse of the Third Reich suggested that liberation could be near. But in the isolated fortress of Castle Itter, hope and danger were intertwined, and freedom remained uncertain. The fortress itself was a formidable structure. Its walls were thick and cold, built to withstand sieges and invasions, but designed long before modern artillery and tanks. Snow and ice clung to the parapets, and the bitter alpine winds whistled through the battlements, carrying with them an eerie mix of silence and distant gunfire. Within these walls, tension was palpable. The prisoners, though physically protected, were psychologically trapped. They had seen the SS execute captives elsewhere without hesitation and knew that the slightest provocation could result in death. Their guards, loyal to the Nazi cause even as the world crumbled, maintained strict surveillance, patrolling the corridors with weapons at the ready and eyes cold with ideology. Each day was a test of patience, courage, and resilience. Outside the castle, the world was equally precarious. The approaching SS units were fanatical and disciplined, motivated by ideology even as their cause disintegrated. Meanwhile, elements of the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, faced a moral and strategic dilemma. Many had recognized the futility of continued fighting and sought surrender to the Allies, hoping to avoid unnecessary deaths. Others, bound by loyalty or fear, continued to follow orders, even as the Nazi regime disintegrated around them, Within this fractured reality, individual choices became extraordinarily consequential. Among the figures in this precarious setting was Lieutenant Joseph Gangl of the Wehrmacht. Gangl had witnessed the horrors of the SS firsthand, executions, torture, and the exploitation of prisoners for ideological purposes. He had grown disillusioned with the Nazi cause, realizing that loyalty to orders should never outweigh moral responsibility. Quietly, he began providing protection and assistance to the French prisoners within Castle Itter. He coordinated small acts of defiance, ensuring that captives received basic necessities and that their lives were preserved whenever possible. Gangl's actions were incredibly risky. Discovery by the SS could mean immediate execution. Yet he persisted, guided by a sense of duty not to the Reich, but to humanity itself. As the days progressed toward early May, intelligence reports began to circulate. ASS detachment was moving through the Alpine valleys, intent on executing the high-profile prisoners. The SS force was composed of elite, fanatical troops, well-armed and highly motivated to complete their mission, regardless of the collapsing state of the Third Reich. The threat was imminent, and Castle Itter, despite its imposing walls, would face one of the most unusual and dramatic confrontations of the war. The stakes were clear. Failure meant death for the prisoners, Gangl, and anyone who dared oppose the SS, while success required extraordinary courage, coordination, and resourcefulness. Meanwhile, Captain John C. Lee, Jr., leading a small American unit advancing into Austria, was approaching the region. Lee had fought through Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, experiencing the full intensity and chaos of World War II, yet nothing in his military career had prepared him for what awaited at Castle Itter, the idea that American soldiers might have to coordinate with German defectors to protect French prisoners against SS forces was almost unimaginable, but necessity demanded extraordinary alliances. Inside the castle, the French prisoners waited, anxious and uncertain. Some attempted to maintain dignity and morale, organizing small routines and keeping each other informed of the outside situation. Others fell into despair, reflecting on the years of captivity, the deaths of comrades, and the brutality they had endured. Together, they created a fragile community within the fortress walls, bound by shared suffering and a collective hope that the Allies would soon arrive. The psychological tension was constant, trust was scarce, fear aboon, and hope precarious. Yet even in this dire situation, the human spirit persisted. The environment itself amplified the drama. The Alpine snow created treacherous conditions for any approaching force. Narrow passes, icy cliffs, and heavy snowfall meant that only the most disciplined and prepared troops could approach the castle effectively. The bitter cold added another layer of urgency. Prolonged exposure could weaken even the strongest soldiers. Visibility was limited, and the mountains echoed every sound. Footsteps, gunfire, and shouted orders traveled across the valleys, creating a tense auditory landscape. Every defender, prisoner, and approaching soldier had to account for not only human enemies but the unforgiving environment itself. As the first signs of the SS approach appeared on the horizon, the defenders began to understand the gravity of the moment. The coming battle would be unlike any other, a convergence of ideology, desperation, and moral courage. The stakes were life and death, and the choices made in the coming hours would define not only the immediate outcome, but the legacy of Castle Itter in this frozen fortress high in the Austrian Alps. History was poised to unfold in a way that would later be remembered as one of the strangest and most remarkable battles of World War II, where former enemies could become allies and humanity could triumph even amidst chaos and destruction, the unlikely alliance preparing for the strangest battle. With the SS advance confirmed, the fortress of Castle Itter transformed from a place of passive captivity into a hive of urgent activity. Lieutenant Joseph Gangle, increasingly defined by conscience rather than ideology, took on a critical leadership role. He moved quietly through the icy corridors, checking on prisoners, assessing defensive positions, and calculating how best to utilize the limited manpower at his disposal. Each decision carried immense weight. One miscalculation could lead to the death of the French captives, the destruction of the castle, or the annihilation of his small contingent of Wehrmacht soldiers willing to defy the SS. The castle itself, centuries old, offered both advantage and limitation. Its thick stone walls could absorb small arms fire, and its elevated position provided excellent vantage points over the approaching valley. Yet the fortress had not been designed to repel modern military forces armed with machine guns, explosives, and coordinated assault tactics. Gangle knew that every entry point needed to be reinforced, every window barricaded, and every corridor strategically covered to maximize defensive potential. Inside the castle, the French prisoners, though initially uncertain of Gangle's intentions, began to recognize the extraordinary circumstances they faced. Many were former generals or high-ranking officials who understood the principles of defense, reconnaissance, and small unit tactics. They were no longer just captives. They became participants in their own survival. Gangle encouraged them to take an active role, giving them tasks that ranged from relaying messages to setting up makeshift barricades. It was an unlikely partnership former, enemies collaborating under extreme circumstances, but necessity forged bonds stronger than ideology. The prisoners, previously reliant solely on hope and the eventual arrival of Allied forces, now found themselves engaged in active defense, their fear tempered by the need to act decisively. Across the valley, Captain John C. Lee Jr. led his small American unit forward, aware that time was slipping away. The intelligence indicated that the SS unit approaching Castle Itter was disciplined, heavily armed, and relentless. Lee understood that traditional tactics might not suffice in this unique engagement. His men, though trained and battle-hardened, had never encountered a situation where they would be cooperating with defecting German soldiers to defend French prisoners. Against the SS, the operation required precision, adaptability, and unwavering resolve. Lee and Gangle coordinated through a precarious system of messengers and signals. Recognizing that mutual trust was essential, yet fragile. As the defenders fortified the castle, the psychological dimension of the battle became increasingly apparent. Fear, adrenaline, and anticipation mixed with the bitter alpine cold to create a tense and charged atmosphere. The prisoners grappled with memories of past suffering and the realization that their survival depended on the willingness of enemies to fight alongside them. Gangle's soldiers faced moral dilemmas as well. Defying the SS could mean execution, yet surrendering would guarantee the deaths of the prisoners. For Lee and his American men, the challenge was not just strategic, but profoundly human. They were about to enter a battle that defied conventional logic, where the lines between friend and foe were blurred by circumstance and necessity. Every defensive measure was meticulously planned. Gangel identified vantage points from which snipers could cover the approach, while barricades were reinforced with furniture, timber, and any materials available. Windows were shuttered, and loopholes were cut to allow defenders to fire while remaining protected. The courtyards were cleared of debris that could impede movement, yet small hidden traps were laid to slow the SS advance. Communication lines were established between different sectors of the castle, and runners were assigned to carry messages between commanders, prisoners, and the American soldiers who would soon arrive. The defenders recognized that coordination was as critical as firepower. The environment itself played a silent but deadly role. Snow covered every surface, reflecting the pale morning light and offering both camouflage and hazard. Narrow mountain paths leading to the fortress were treacherous, and any misstep could mean death from exposure or falling. Visibility was limited, and the wind carried sounds in unpredictable ways, making it difficult to determine the exact location of approaching forces. Despite these obstacles, the defenders used the terrain to their advantage, planning ambush points and choke points that could disrupt the SS advance. The cold was relentless. Frostbite threatened the hands and faces of anyone exposed for long periods, and the chill seeped into the stone walls, chilling the defenders even within the fortress. Amidst this preparation, interpersonal dynamics became increasingly important. The French prisoners, once suspicious of Gangel and his intentions, began to trust him, recognizing the moral courage and practical competence he displayed. They offered insights based on their military experience, helping to optimize defensive positions and anticipate enemy strategies. Gangel, in turn, acknowledged the value of their knowledge, relying on their guidance to supplement his limited manpower. The Americans, initially cautious of working with Wehrmacht soldiers, gradually accepted the necessity of the alliance, understanding that without cooperation, the outcome would likely be catastrophique. The castle's occupants, once divided by nationality, ideology, and circumstance, were now unified by the immediate need to survive. As the SS drew closer, tension reached a fever pitch. Lookouts reported movement in the valley below the telltale glint of rifles, the crunch of boots on ice and snow. Every defender held their position, hearts pounding, breath visible in the frigid air, eyes scanning for any sign of the enemy. Orders were whispered across corridors, and everyone understood that the coming hours would test not just skill, but courage, discipline, and moral fortitude. The fortress, silent for centuries, now braced for an unprecedented confrontation, a battle where history, circumstance, and human courage converged in a way that few could have anticipated. Gangel moved through the corridors one last time, checking on his men and the prisoners. He reminded them of the stakes, emphasizing coordination, communication, and calm under pressure. "We are un illumine." This together, he told them quietly. And only by acting as one can we survive. Lee did the same with his American soldiers, reinforcing defensive positions, checking ammunition, and preparing them mentally for the chaos that was about to unfold. Every detail mattered, every door barricade, every weapon positioned, every contingency accounted for. The psychological tension was matched only by the physical preparations. Trenches were dug where possible, loopholes for rifles cut into walls, and rudimentary traps laid to slow enemy movement. Snow and ice complicated movement, but also offered concealment. Defenders rehearsed movements quietly, practicing how to fall back, regroup, and maintain coverage. Every scenario was considered, and every participant understood that their actions could mean the difference between life and death. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the distant sound of approaching troops grew louder. The SS were near, their advance relentless and disciplined. Castle Itter, perched above the valley, was ready, or as ready as it could be under the circumstances. Within the fortress, a tense calm settled over defenders and prisoners alike. Weapons were ready, barricades fortified, and alliances forged in necessity held fast. The stage was set for one of the most extraordinary battles of the Second World War, a confrontation that would challenge conventional notions of enemy and ally and create a story that would echo through history as the strangest. Battle of Castle. The battle begins, chaos and courage at Castle Itter. The morning of May 5, 1945, dawned with a pale, icy light spilling over the snow-covered Alps, Castle Itter. Perched atop its hill like a sentinel over the valley, braced for the storm that was about to descend. The defenders, an unlikely coalition of American soldiers, Wehrmacht defectors led by Lieutenant Joseph Gangl, and high-profile French prisoners stood in tense anticipation. Every eye scanned the distant tree line. Every hand clutched a weapon, and every heartbeat seemed to echo the silent urgency of the moment. The air was frigid, and each breath hung visibly in the cold morning mist. Mingling with the anticipation and fear that thickened the atmosphere within the stone walls. As the first SS patrols crested the valley slopes, the defenders prepared for the impossible. The SS were elite, fanatic troops, relentless in their mission to execute the French prisoners before the Allies could intervene. They had been trained for efficiency and brutality, and their approach reflected both discipline and ideology. Snow crunched under their boots, rifles glinted in the pale light, and every movement carried the menace of imminent violence. The defenders, by contrast, were a mixture of battle-hardened Americans, morally courageous Wehrmacht soldiers, and civilians turned fighters. Their cohesion had been forged in the preceding days, under the pressure of preparation and the shadow of death, but now the true test awaited. The first shots rang out across the snow-laden courtyard. The sound echoed through the mountains, bouncing off stone walls, cliffs, and rooftops, creating a cacophony of fear and determination. Gangl, positioned near the main gate with a small group of his soldiers, directed fire with calm precision, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. Cover the flanks, hold your positions. Do not let them breach the inner courtyard. Captain Lee, coordinating with American. Riflemen stationed at higher vantage points returned fire methodically, every shot deliberate. The French prisoners, now armed under Gangl's guidance, moved to strategic positions, ready to defend themselves and their captors-turned allies. It was an improbable sight, former enemies bound together by necessity, fighting side by side against a force driven by ideology and fanaticism. The SS launched their initial assault on the main gate, attempting to overpower the defenders with sheer numbers and aggressive tactics. Their machine guns rattled, sending hailstorms of bullets against the stone walls, while grenades exploded in the snow-covered courtyard. But the castle's defenders were prepared. Gangle had reinforced weak points, and every inch of the courtyard was covered by riflemen and strategically placed barricades. American sharpshooters picked off advancing soldiers with precision, while Wehrmacht soldiers used their intimate knowledge of the fortress to anticipate enemy mouvement. Every moment was a delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. Amidst the chaos, close-quarter combat erupted. SS soldiers who breached the outer courtyard were met with hand-to-hand resistance. Gangle himself engaged in fierce combat, striking and parrying with practiced efficiency. At one point, he saved a French general from being captured by a group of SS soldiers, pulling him to safety and using his own body as a shield. The Americans, though fewer in number, used disciplined fire to hold the flanks, covering retreats and reinforcing vulnerable positions. The French prisoners, initially terrified, now participated actively, moving ammunition, relaying messages, and firing where they could. The once passive captives had become defenders of their own lives, displaying courage and resolve that surprised even their seasoned allies. The battlefield was surreal. Snow quickly turned red in areas of contact, smoke from rifles and grenades mingled with. The cold morning air and the cries of the wounded echoed off stone walls and icy cliffs. The defenders shouted in German, English, and French, their voices blending into a symphony of coordinated chaos. Every second carried weight. Hesitation could be fatal. Yet, even in the intensity of battle, moments of extraordinary humanity emerged. An American soldier shielded a fallen French officer from incoming fire. A Wehrmacht soldier risked his life to drag a wounded comrade to safety, and Gangle moved tirelessly between positions, issuing orders, encouragement, and moral support. The battle was not only a test of skill and strategy, but a crucible of character, revealing the depth of courage possible when ideology gives way to necessity and humanity. As the morning progressed, the defenders adapted to the SS tactics. Gangle anticipated flanking maneuvers, repositioning his men to cover blind spots. Lee coordinated counterattacks with precision, using the castle's elevation to deliver suppressive fire while protecting weaker positions. The prisoners, acting as lookouts and messengers, relayed critical information about enemy movements within the courtyard. Improvised traps slowed the SS advance, forcing them into predictable channels that allowed defenders to maximize the effectiveness of their limited firepower. Coordination, adaptability, and courage became as critical as ammunition and weaponry in determining the outcome of each exchange. The SS pressed relentlessly, determined to break the fortress. They lobbed grenades into courtyards, attempted to scale walls, and deployed squads to exploit every perceived weakness. Yet the defenders held, using a combination of preparation, terrain, and sheer determination to repel each assault. Snow, once a hindrance, became a tactical ally, slowing enemy movement and revealing footprints for sharpshooters. The frozen environment challenged both sides, sapping strength, numbing extremities, and demanding endurance. Every action, from firing a rifle to carrying a wounded comrade, required immense effort in the biting cold. Hours passed in relentless combat. The SS were disciplined, but the defenders' unity proved unexpectedly resilient. Gangel's knowledge of the castle, combined with Lee's tactical leadership and the prisoners' experience, created a network of coordinated defense that frustrated every assault. Morale, surprisingly high under the circumstances, was maintained by the shared understanding that every action could save lives. Moments of improvisation turned the tide repeatedly. A barricade reinforced with furniture held back a critical push. A sniper's precise shot halted an advancing squad, and the courage of individual prisoners inspired their allies to fight harder. By midday, the defenders were exhausted but unbroken. Snow-stained red, walls scarred by gunfire, and the air thick with smoke and tension, Castle Itter stood as a testament to human resilience. Yet the battle was far trop mauvais. The SS continued to probe, testing defenses and seeking any vulnerability. Every defender knew that endurance was as critical as strategy. A lapse in concentration could be fatal. Gangel, Lee, and the French prisoners remained vigilant, coordinating movements, distributing ammunition, and maintaining morale under extreme conditions. The fortress had become a crucible, testing every aspect of courage, skill, and human determination. As the afternoon wore on, the first signs of au papier raide. Scouts reported distant movements in the Valley. American reinforcements advancing to engage the SS from behind. The defenders understood that their actions had bought critical time. Their extraordinary alliance, forged under pressure and necessity, had held against an elite enemy long enough to change the course of the battle. Yet, even with reinforcements approaching, the situation remained perilous. Each second continued to demand bravery, precision, and coordination. The defenders had survived the morning's onslaught, but the battle for Castle Itter was still unfolding, and the human cost was evident in every scarred wall, fallen soldier, and exhausted fighter. In this surreal confrontation, Castle Itter became more than a fortress. It became a stage for one of the most improbable and heroic episodes of World War II. Former enemies had united, prisoners had fought for survival, and a small contingent of soldiers had held a strategic position against overwhelming odds. The battle demonstrated that even in the darkest hours of conflict, cooperation, moral courage, and human ingenuity could produce outcomes that defied expectation. It was a battle defined not just by strategy or firepower, but by the extraordinary choices, bravery, and resilience of individuals faced with impossible circumstances. Turning the tide, reinforcements, and heroism. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the snow-covered Alps, Castle Itter's defenders had already endured hours of relentless assault. The SS, relentless in their mission, continued to press the attack, seeking any weakness in the improvised fortifications. Their machine guns rattled, rifles cracked, and grenades exploded against the stone walls, sending shards of masonry into the frozen courtyard. Yet, despite exhaustion, fear, and the harsh alpine cold, the coalition of Americans, Wehrmacht soldiers, and French prisoners held firm. Every defender understood that the lives of the captives and their own survival depended on maintaining cohesion, precision, and courage under fire. Lieutenant Joseph Gangel moved tirelessly among the defensive positions, coordinating fire, distributing ammunition, and directing reinforcements where they were most needed. His knowledge of the castle's layout proved invaluable. He anticipated the SS's maneuvers, fortifying blind spots, and using narrow corridors as choke points to neutralize enemy advantages. Every action he took was calculated, a blend of tactical skill and moral responsibility. Gangel's soldiers, aware of his leadership and commitment, fought with renewed determination, inspired by his courage and dedication to protecting lives over ideology. Captain John C. Lee Jr. coordinated the American lines with equal precision. Positioned on elevated vantage points, his sharpshooters picked off advancing SS soldiers, while the main American force covered the flanks and reinforced vulnerable sectors. Lee understood that the battle required more than brute force. It demanded coordination, timing, and exploiting the castle's defensive advantages. He also recognized the unique psychological dynamic at play. Former enemies, now fighting side by side, and he leveraged this shared purpose to maintain morale. The French prisoners, once passive observers of their own fate, now played critical roles. Some acted as lookouts, signaling the approach of SS units. Others assisted in moving ammunition, reinforcing barricades, and even firing under supervision. Their courage, forged through years of captivity and hardship, became a force multiplier for the defenders. As the SS continued their assault, the defenders adapted, using both strategy and improvisation to hold the line. Snow and ice, once impediments, became tactical tools. Tracks left by the advancing enemy revealed their movements, allowing sharpshooters to anticipate attacks. Narrow stairways and corridors were fortified with makeshift barricades, forcing the SS into predictable channels where defenders could concentrate fire. Improvised traps slowed their advance, buying precious time for coordination and communication. Every defensive measure was born of necessity, creativity, and the combined experience of soldiers and prisoners alike. Hours of brutal combat began to take their toll. Fatigue, hunger, and cold gnawed at the defenders, yet they pressed on, driven by the urgency of survival and the responsibility they felt. Toward the French captives, snow-stained with blood, the fortress bore the marks of violence and resilience. Cries of the wounded echoed off the stone walls, blending with the sounds of gunfire and explosions to create a surreal, almost apocalyptic soundscape. Yet, amidst the chaos, moments of extraordinary heroism emerged. An American soldier dragged a wounded French officer to safety while returning fire. A Wehrmacht soldier held off a group of attackers to allow civilians to move to secure areas, and Gangel repeatedly risked his life to organize counterattacks, ensuring the cohesion of the defense. By late afternoon, the first signs of hope appeared. Scouts reported movement in the valley below. American reinforcements were approaching, navigating the treacherous mountain passes to reach the beleaguered fortress. The defenders understood that their coordinated effort had bought enough time for relief to arrive. The impending arrival of reinforcements transformed the psychological landscape of the battle. Exhaustion and fear were tempered by anticipation and renewed determination. Every shot, every barricade, and every defensive maneuver now carried the potential to secure a decisive advantage. As the reinforcements closed in, the SS recognized the changing balance of power. Their attacks became more desperate and less coordinated, reflecting both exhaustion and the awareness that the castle might not fall. Gangel and Lee capitalized on this shift, ordering targeted counterattacks that pushed the SS back from key positions. American artillery, coordinated from the surrounding hills, added suppressive fire, further slowing the enemy advance. Trapped in increasingly vulnerable positions, the SS began to retreat, their initial confidence replaced by urgency and disarray. Amidst the retreat, acts of courage and humanity continued to define the defenders' response. Gangel personally rescued a French general trapped by collapsing debris, shielding him from gunfire as they navigated back to a fortified section of the castle. Lee organized covering fire for injured soldiers and prisoners, ensuring that no one was left behind. French prisoners, now fully integrated into the defense, carried ammunition, relayed messages, and engaged in firefights that few could have imagined them surviving just days earlier. The synergy of this unlikely coalition proved decisive, turning what could have been a massacre into a strategic and moral victory. By evening, the battle for Castle Itter had largely been decided. The SS, recognizing the futility of further assault, retreated into the valley, leaving behind a fortress still standing, defenders still alive, and prisoners still free. The castle, though battered and scarred, had withstood one of the strangest and most improbable battles of World War II. Snow, smoke, and the residue of gunfire hung in the air, a testament to both the violence of the engagement and the resilience of those who had survived. In the aftermath, the defenders tended to the wounded, assessed damage, and fortified positions in anticipation of any renewed assault. The psychological relief was immense, tempered by the knowledge that survival had been precarious at every moment. Gangel and his Wehrmacht soldiers were celebrated by both the Americans and the French prisoners. Their moral courage and tactical skill acknowledged even amidst the chaos of the collapsing Reich. Tragically, Gangel would later fall in subsequent fighting, but his actions at Castle Itter became emblematic of bravery, moral integrity, and the extraordinary possibilities of human cooperation under dire circumstances. The Battle of Castle Itter, while minor in scale compared to larger engagements of the war, became legendary for its uniqueness. It demonstrated that even in the most extreme circumstances, humanity, morality, and courage could prevail. Former enemies had fought side by side, prisoners had defended themselves and others, and a small but determined force had successfully repelled elite SS units. It was a story of survival, strategy, and moral heroism, proving that even in the darkest hours of conflict, extraordinary acts of bravery could emerge. As night fell over the Alps, Castle Itter stood as a symbol of improbable victory. Fires smouldered in the courtyard, wounded soldiers and prisoners were tended to, and a tenuous calm settled over the fortress. But Petite Legacy had only just begun. History would remember it not for the number of casualties or the scale of destruction, but for the astonishing alliances formed, the courage displayed, and the moral choices that defined the outcome. In the cold silence of the Alpine night, survivors reflected on what they had endured, a testament to the human spirit, the power of cooperation, and the strange, remarkable circumstances that had allowed life to triumph over ideology and death. Aftermath and legacy, courage, remembered at Castle Itter. As night settled over the snow-covered Alps, the echoes of gunfire and the chaos of battle gave way to an eerie stillness. Castle Itter, once the site of frantic preparations and relentless combat, now stood battered but unconquered. The fortress bore the scars of the most improbable battle of World War II, stone walls pockmarked with bullets, barricades shattered and rebuilt, snow-stained with the blood of both attackers and defenders. Within its walls, the surviving defenders Americans, Wehrmacht soldiers, and French prisoners emerged from the immediacy of combat into the fragile relief of survival. Exhaustion weighed heavily upon every man, yet amidst fatigue, a profound sense of shared accomplishment permeated the fortress. Lieutenant Joseph Gangle and Morel were instrumental in holding the castle, moved among the wounded, ensuring that every injured soldier and prisoner received care. His calm, deliberate presence inspired confidence and stability in a situation that had pushed all involved to the edge of human endurance. Gangle had acted against ideology, against orders, and against fear, prioritizing human life above all else. For the French prisoners, he was no longer an enemy officer. He was a protector, a savior, and a symbol of integrity in a world dominated by moral compromise. Tragically, Gangle's story would later be marked by the ultimate sacrifice as he fell in subsequent combat. Yet this actions at Castle Itter ensured that dozens of lives were preserved, cementing his place in history as an extraordinary example of moral courage under fire. Captain John C. Lee, Jr. and his American soldiers surveyed the aftermath with a mix of relief and somber reflection. Reinforcements had arrived just in time to secure the fortress, but the cost of the battle was evident. Wounded soldiers, both American and German, were treated with urgency and care. French manie of Wehrmacht, being active participants in the defense, tended to each other with a newfound camaraderie forged in extreme adversity. Lee recognized the profound uniqueness of what had transpired. A coalition of former enemies had defended the vulnerable, demonstrating that humanity, cooperation, and moral choice could prevail even in the midst of war. In the following days, the castle became a temporary hub of recovery, reflection, and documentation. Survivors recounted the sequence of events, ensuring that the extraordinary collaboration and bravery of all involved were recorded. French generals detailed the critical role played by their defenders, emphasizing not only Gangle's leadership, but also the courage exhibited by American soldiers and fellow prisoners. Wehrmacht soldiers, who had chosen to resist the SS in defense of human life, recounted their own fears, dilemmas, and acts of heroism. Their narratives highlighted the moral complexities of the closing days of the Third Reich, illustrating that decisions guided by conscience could still triumph amidst widespread fanaticism and chaos. The psychological impact of the battle was profound. Survivors experienced a complex mix of emotions: relief, pride, exhaustion, grief, and, in some cases, survivors' guilt. The French prisoners, who had endured years of captivity and witnessed atrocities, were confronted with the paradoxical experience of being defended by soldiers of the nation that had once occupied their homeland. This unexpected alliance underscored the possibility of redemption, moral courage, and human empathy, in a context dominated by conflict and cruelty. For the Americans, witnessing Wehrmacht soldiers acting against ideology to protect life challenged traditional notions of friend and foe, leaving an indelible impression on those who had participated in the defense. In broader historical context, the Battle of Castle Itter was minor in scale compared to the massive engagements occurring elsewhere in Europe. Yet its significance lies not in numbers, but in its uniqueness and moral resonance. Here, the lines between enemy and ally blurred. Prisoners and captors fought side by side. Acts of individual courage and ethical decision-making shaped the outcome more than sheer firepower or numerical superiority. The battle illustrated that even in a total war, where ideology and orders often dictated actions, human conscience and moral choice could alter history. Castle Itter became a symbol of hope, courage, and the extraordinary capacity for cooperation in extreme circumstances. The aftermath also highlighted the fragility and cost of such moral courage. Joseph Gangel's ultimate sacrifice served as a reminder that acts of bravery often come at a price, and that recognition of heroism may not be immediate. Nevertheless, his legacy endured through the lives he saved, the alliances he forged, and the inspiration his actions provided to both contemporaries and future. Génération. French prisoners, Americans, and German soldiers alike would carry memories of those tense, snow-covered hours for the rest of their lives, recounting stories of heroism, solidarity, and improbable victory. Reflecting on the battle, one can see lessons that extend beyond military strategy or historical interest. The events at Castle Itter demonstrate that moral courage and decisive action can coexist with strategy and tactical skill. They illustrate that even in circumstances dominated by hatred, fear, and chaos, human beings have the capacity to act ethically, bravely, and decisively to protect life. The battle serves as a powerful reminder that the choices of individuals matter, that cooperation can emerge in the most unlikely circumstances, and that humanity can triumph even when ideology seeks to dehumanize. In the years following the war, Castle Itter remained a poignant symbol of this extraordinary episode. Historians, scholars, and survivors recounted the events in books, articles, and documentaries, highlighting the convergence of unlikely allies and the moral courage that defined the battle. Memorials and historical markers commemorated those who fought and died, particularly honoring Gangel and his comrades who had risked everything to save lives. The fortress itself became a physical testament to the improbable victory, standing as a reminder of the human capacity for courage, collaboration, and ethical choice even amidst the horrors of war. Daudet. The Battle of Castle Itter is studied not only for its military significance, but also for its moral and ethical lessons. It challenges simplistic narratives of enemy and ally, illustrating that circumstances can forge unexpected alliances and that moral courage can transcend ideology. For modern audiences, the story resonates with timeless relevance in situations of crisis, extreme adversity, or moral ambiguity. Individuals have the power to choose humanity over ideology, cooperation. Over division and Kekur over fear, the defenders of Castle Itter American soldiers, Wehrmacht defectors, and French prisoners alike embodied these principles, creating a legacy that continues to inspire. Ultimately, the story of Castle Itter is one of improbable heroism. It demonstrates that even in the darkest hours of World War II, amid chaos, death, and despair, acts of bravery, moral choice, and human solidarity could alter the course of events and save lives. It is a story of courage, remembered, a battle that defied convention, and a testament to the enduring potential for cooperation and ethical action in a world otherwise defined by conflict and cruelty. As the snow melted from the Alpine slopes and Europe began the slow process of rebuilding, the memory of Castle Itter remained, a stark and enduring symbol of hope, resilience, and the remarkable capacity of humans to act with courage and integrity even when history itself seemed to teeter on the brink of darkness.